The Last Ride. It was a cool autumn evening in a small, sleepy town in Montana. The sky had just started turning purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. The rusted tracks of the railroad ran alongside the main street, where families and farmers usually took the quiet roads without much interruption. But tonight, the calm was about to shatter. For years, the local chapter of the Ironclad Riders had made this stretch of highway their home. Known for their long, bearded faces and tattoos, the Riders were legends on the open road. The small town, with its dusty bars and roadside diners, had always accepted them. A little loud, maybe a bit rough around the edges, but harmless. They were the ones who held the history of the highways. Stories of places no one else cared to go, and a community that had long existed outside the mainstream. But this night wasn't just any night. The town had heard rumors that the government was planning something big, a sort of reclaiming of places where the bikers had settled for years. They didn't know exactly what was coming, but whispers were getting louder. As the riders revved their engines and rolled down the highway toward the diner, a small crowd gathered outside, some curious, some concerned. The bikers always caused a stir, but tonight felt different. Something in the air was thicker, charged. They didn't know that outside of town, a convoy of military trucks had begun to position themselves for a show of force. The town was caught in a strange crossfire of tension between freedom and control. While the bikers rallied in their usual rough camaraderie, enjoying their final moments of rebellion on the open road, others in the town, the bystanders, watched uneasily. They were torn between loyalty to the riders, who had always supported them, and fear of what might come next. The government's plans were rumored to involve cracking down on groups like the Ironclad Riders, putting them under tighter surveillance or disbanding them entirely. Then the trucks rolled into town. At first, no one noticed. The sound of engines blended with the rumbling of the riders. It wasn't until soldiers, dressed in tactical gear and carrying weapons, began marching into the diner parking lot that the truth hit home. The bikers, who had been laughing and enjoying their last ride for what they thought was freedom, suddenly faced a wall of soldiers in front of them. The military had arrived. One of the riders, a man known as Shredder for his wild ride and unruly attitude, saw the soldiers approaching and stood up, eyes narrowing. The local sheriff, who had been trying to mediate peace between the government and the riders, stepped forward, his hands raised in an attempt to defuse the situation. "Listen, we don't want any trouble. This is a peaceful town," the sheriff said, but the soldiers weren't listening. They were there for a reason, and it wasn't to negotiate. Shredder's voice rang out loud, challenging. "We've been here for years. You can't just come in and take us out like that." But the soldiers had orders. As the standoff unfolded, townsfolk watched from the windows, unsure whether to get involved. Some were silently cheering on the bikers. Others were scared of the consequences. The soldiers began advancing, pushing the riders back, using their size and power to intimidate. It wasn't long before Shredder, with the stubbornness that made him who he was, revved his bike and tried to push through the lines of soldiers. But as he accelerated, he didn't see the military Humvees positioned in the alleyway. It wasn't a fair fight, there was no escape for him. With one swift motion, soldiers surrounded him, pulling him off his bike and cuffing his hands behind his back. The bystanders, who had once cheered for the freedom of the open road, were now watching the breaking point, the moment when rebellion met reality. There were no cheers this time, only the heavy silence of a town realizing that their way of life was slipping through their fingers. One by one, the bikers were subdued, their bikes taken from them, their future uncertain. The bystanders, caught in the crossfire, realized they had no choice but to watch. The soldiers didn't care about the history of the town, nor did they care about the bonds the riders had built with the locals. The military presence was all about control and power, and they had come to enforce their will. As the convoy pulled out of town, the bikes, once a symbol of freedom, were now a distant memory. The bystanders, who had always known the riders as friends and neighbors, looked at the empty streets where roaring engines once echoed. For the bikers, it was the end of an era. For the town, it was a reminder of the changing times and the price of peace. And as the last truck disappeared into the distance, one thing was clear: the town would never be the same again.